Danny Vance wasn't supposed to be at the board. He was the quiet, almost invisible kid in the back of the class, the one who delivered pizzas at night and coasted through school with a near-perfect record, without ever lifting a finger in class. The teacher never called on him. The other students never noticed him. He liked it that way, but today, that all changed. "Danny, solve this!" Mr. Reed's voice boomed across the room as he scrawled an impossible equation on the whiteboard. The class fell silent, the tension almost visible in the air. Danny's heart skipped a beat. His hands went clammy. Impossible. That's what it looked like. No one in this room, not even Mr. Reed, would be able to solve it. Everyone expected him to fail. What if I can't do it? But then a strange calm washed over him. He'd been solving equations like this for years, just not on a classroom board. He'd done it alone in the quiet of the night, the hum of the city outside his window, the only sound accompanying his pen as he worked through the intricate dance of numbers and symbols. He was no ordinary student. No one in this room knew that, and they were about to find out. The whispers began as soon as Danny stepped toward the board. Some laughed, assuming he'd stumble. Others exchanged confused glances. Who is this pizza boy to challenge Mr. Reed's genius-level questions? But Danny didn't hear them. His focus was absolute. He could almost hear the numbers in his mind, moving like fluid thoughts, solving themselves. With each stroke of his marker, the equation came to life under his hands. He wasn't just solving it, he was dominating it. By the time he finished, the room had gone completely silent. Mr. Reed's eyes widened. A bead of sweat formed on his brow. The class stared, stunned into disbelief. Danny had done the impossible, and no one, especially Mr. Reed, had any idea how. Danny Vance wasn't what anyone would call remarkable, at least not in the conventional sense. He didn't have the athletic build that would earn him a spot on the school's football team. His clothes didn't carry the latest brand names, and his hair was perpetually messy, as if he couldn't be bothered with things like combing or grooming. To most, Danny was just another nameless face in a crowded high school hallway, the kind you might forget as soon as you pass them. But Danny had learned to blend in. In fact, he'd become a master of it. By day, he attended classes at Ridgeview High, where he slipped under the radar, avoiding attention like the plague. His teachers didn't bother to learn his name beyond a quick glance at the roster, and his classmates either ignored him or dismissed him as the quiet, average kid who sat in the back row. For years, this invisibility had been a protective shield. He didn't want anyone to notice him. The last thing he wanted was to stand out, be asked a question, or be forced into the spotlight. That would mean exposure, something Danny had been avoiding since he could remember. The classroom was a cold place for Danny. The hum of fluorescent lights, the sound of pencils scratching paper, the drone of the teacher's voice, it all felt distant, far removed from the world he found solace in. His mind would often wander during lessons, not because he was lazy or uninterested, but because his mind operated at a different rhythm. The numbers in his head were louder than anything the teacher had to say. Mathematics is beautiful, he would think to himself. And yet, here in the classroom, the only beauty he found was in the equations that no one else seemed to understand. Danny had never been taught math the way his peers had. He wasn't following a prescribed path, he was building his own. At night, however, Danny became something else entirely. His world transformed after the bell rang, signaling the end of another monotonous school day. While most kids went home to study or hang out, Danny clocked into his second job, delivering pizzas across Brooklyn. The streets were his sanctuary, the noise of the city and the relentless rhythm of the tires on asphalt oddly calming. There in the night, he could think. Driving alone through darkened streets, Danny found his mind unfurling like the petals of a flower. The numbers came to him in patterns, in flashes of clarity, not unlike the way a piece of music builds up from a single note. He'd been solving equations for years, often long after midnight, as the world outside his car drifted into silence. It was during these solitary hours that Danny's true gift emerged. He'd look at a pizza delivery receipt, and the numbers would start talking to him, turning into complex mathematical puzzles, symmetries, and algorithms. He'd mentally calculate his way through them while driving, silently laughing to himself, when he realized that no one would ever see him as the genius he was. The thrill of the puzzle was what kept him going, not the acknowledgement. Math had always been his refuge. It was his mother who had sparked his love for it in the first place. When Danny was little, she'd spend hours with him, sitting at the kitchen table, her tired eyes still lighting up when they tackled math problems together. His mother was always busy, working multiple jobs to keep them afloat, but when she could, she'd help him with puzzles and equations, giving him the tools to see the world in a way no one else seemed to. "Think of it like a game, Danny," she'd say with a tired smile. "The numbers are just waiting to be arranged. It's all about finding the right sequence, the right solution. There's a beauty in that. The rest of the world might not see it, but it's there." That sense of beauty in the chaos was something Danny carried with him every day, especially during his late-night drives. He'd mentally solve equations that far exceeded what he was taught in school, working through them like a silent virtuoso. The solitude of those nights was both his joy and his curse. He didn't need recognition. The puzzle was enough. Yet, Danny's greatest fear, far more than failing a test or facing an awkward situation, was being seen for what he truly was. The idea of standing out, of being noticed for something so extraordinary, was terrifying to him. So he kept his brilliance hidden beneath layers of indifference and awkwardness. His discomfort with attention became apparent in the smallest of moments. In class, when a teacher called on him to answer a question, Danny would stiffen, his throat tightening as if the words themselves were choking him. He would shrink into himself, muttering an answer so quietly it barely carried to the front of the room, and then quickly return to the shadows of his seat. The moment he could, Danny would avoid eye contact, focusing instead on the math notes that filled his notebook, even though his mind was far beyond the simple equations they were learning. He was invisible for a reason, and that reason had worked. For years, but one thing Danny couldn't control was what happened next. Mr. Reed had never been a man of many words, and certainly not a man of soft words. At 47, he had long abandoned any illusions about what it meant to be a nice teacher. His graying hair was always slightly unkempt, his glasses perpetually perched on the edge of his nose as though he were perpetually squinting at the world, likely a metaphor for his view of his students. His attire was simple: dark slacks, a button-up shirt, and a worn-out tie that had clearly seen better days. But his presence in the classroom was anything but forgettable. There was an air of indifference that clung to him, like an old familiar scent, one that didn't need to be spoken to be felt. Math had always been his life. He was a man who took a certain pride in the subject's beauty, but also in its ruthless impartiality. To Mr. Reed, math wasn't a subject you could half-ass. Numbers didn't lie, equations didn't bend, and solutions didn't care about excuses. His philosophy was simple: if you don't try, you don't deserve to succeed. This wasn't a pleasant truth to hear for the students of Ridgeview High, many of whom were content to coast by with the bare minimum, scribbling in their notebooks as though the answers would come to them through sheer willpower. And that was exactly what he hated. Mr. Reed's classroom was a place where failure was an invitation, not a punishment. He didn't waste time holding hands or sugarcoating reality. If you couldn't keep up, too bad. If you didn't care, well, that was even worse. He had no time for apathy. The students who slouched in the back, scribbling nonsense or avoiding his gaze, were his personal enemies. In Mr. Reed's eyes, they were everything that was wrong with the world of education: entitled, lazy, and, worst of all, apathetic. There were whispers about him in the halls. "Mr. Reed's a tough one. Don't even try to act like you know the answers if you don't. He'll call you out in a second." But that didn't bother him. If anything, he thrived on the rumors. They kept the slackers at bay, at least for a little while. His reputation as the math teacher who demanded perfection wasn't an accident. It was by design. He wanted his students to feel the pressure, to understand that what they were being given wasn't just another class to be passed through. Math was a language that spoke truth, whether you liked it or not. And Danny Vance, to Mr. Reed, Danny was a classic. Case of a student who didn't care, a face in the back of the room, avoiding eye contact, barely participating. Mr. Reed noticed him, of course. How could he not? But at first glance, Danny fit the mold of the kind of student Mr. Reed had little patience for. He was quiet, withdrawn, and, more telling than anything else, had never raised his hand once, not even in response to a question that was meant to draw out the half-hearted efforts of the class. In Reed's experience, kids like Danny were either too lazy to engage or too scared to try. Both were unforgivable. On the first day of class, Mr. Reed had walked into the room with his usual rigid stride, tossing his satchel onto his desk before greeting the class with an almost mechanical "good morning." His eyes scanned the room, looking over the faces, reading their expressions as they nervously awaited his first words. Most students shifted in their seats, trying to figure out how to make themselves invisible, while others stared straight ahead, anxious about what would come next. "Let's get this over with," he muttered under his breath, half to himself, half to the room. He opened his textbook and wrote an equation on the board, something simple but unforgiving. "Who can tell me the answer to this?" he asked in his usual no-nonsense tone. The silence that followed was thick with tension. He wasn't interested in excuses, he just wanted answers. The minutes ticked by, and only the sound of scribbling pens broke the oppressive quiet. Mr. Reed's gaze landed on the back of the room, where Danny sat, slumped in his chair. There was something about his posture, something that suggested he was actively trying to disappear. Mr. Reed's lips curled into a tight, knowing smile. "Vance!" he called out, his voice sharp, like a crack of thunder. "What's the answer?" Danny's head snapped up, the sudden attention catching him off guard. He fumbled, his mind racing to find the answer, but the numbers were swimming in front of him. He felt the pressure mounting as the eyes of his classmates fell on him, their judgment palpable even from the distance of his seat. He hated this. He hated how every student in the room expected him to be a failure. Danny stammered, glancing at the board but not really seeing it. "I don't know." Mr. Reed nodded slowly, his expression not one of disappointment, but of something colder, disinterest. "Well, that's one way to go about it," he said, his tone biting. "The right answer. You don't just get it by looking like you're waiting for it to fall into your lap. Try actually working next time. That's how you learn, not by being a spectator." He turned his back and wrote the correct answer on the board without further ceremony, leaving Danny to stew in the discomfort of the moment. The other students shifted, relieved that the attention had moved away from them, but Danny couldn't shake the feeling that this moment had been a sort of judgment, a verdict he couldn't escape. Mr. Reed didn't care to explain further. To him, the lesson was simple. You either do the work or you don't. And Danny, he hadn't yet proven he was willing to do the work. It wasn't just about Danny's lack of participation in class. It was the way Danny carried himself, the subtle ways he distanced himself from others. The boy wasn't even trying. Mr. Reed didn't understand why some students just didn't take math seriously, and it frustrated him to no end. He couldn't fathom a world where a kid like Danny Vance, who had the potential to be a genius, was content to coast by with apathy. To Mr. Reed, this wasn't just laziness. This was disrespect. A student who didn't try, who didn't engage, was a student who didn't deserve any kind of help. They were beneath him. The first few weeks of the semester went by, and Mr. Reed had no reason to think Danny was anything more than just another indifferent face. But every once in a while, during a test or a particularly difficult problem, Mr. Reed would catch Danny's eyes focused intently on the work in front of him, his hand moving quickly across the paper. There was something in that intensity that intrigued Mr. Reed, but he buried the thought. Danny was a slacker, nothing more, nothing less. But deep down, beneath his cynicism, Mr. Reed couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was more to Danny than met the eye, and he would soon learn that he was right. It was an ordinary day in room 402, a small classroom on the second floor of Ridgeview High School. The walls were decorated with math posters, some instructional, some motivational, but the room itself was sterile, its fluorescent lights casting a harsh, unflattering glow over the students. The hum of conversations blended with the scrape of chairs and the occasional snicker as the students filed in, most of them filing into their usual spots. A few took their seats with loud, almost exaggerated sighs, while others immediately pulled out their phones, content to check social media or chat with friends until class officially began. Mr. Reed stood at the front of the room, his arms crossed over his chest, his sharp eyes scanning the room. He had a routine, one that had become as predictable as the ticking of the clock on the wall. The students knew it. He was the kind of teacher who didn't waste time on small talk. He would begin with a short review, dive into the material, and expect everyone to keep up. But today, something felt different. The energy in the room was off, a buzzing undercurrent of distraction that Mr. Reed couldn't ignore. As always, there was a handful of students who had done their homework and were genuinely engaged in the lesson. Jennifer and Adam, seated at the front, were already writing equations in their notebooks, their heads bent in concentration. Then there was Kyle, whose eyes darted between the clock and his phone, hoping Mr. Reed wouldn't notice he was texting under the table. Rachel was chatting with her best friend Sam, a constant hum of whispered gossip they'd long since tuned out Mr. Reed's dry explanations of algebraic concepts. And then there was Danny. In his usual spot at the back of the room, Danny Vance sat with his back slightly hunched, a faint but unmistakable air of isolation around him. He was always in the same spot, tucked away in the corner, half of his attention on the math problems in front of him and the other half on his phone. It wasn't that he wasn't doing his work. He was, in fact, one of the few students who had aced the last test. It was his attitude, or rather his lack of attitude, that irked Mr. Reed. Danny wasn't a troublemaker. He wasn't a problem child. He didn't talk back, he didn't disrupt the class, and he didn't even ask questions. He just existed. It was as if he had no stake in the game at all. His disinterest felt like an affront to everything Mr. Reed stood for. Here was a kid who could be brilliant, someone who clearly understood the material, yet who refused to engage, who never raised his hand or participated in discussions. To Mr. Reed, this apathy wasn't just frustrating, it was disrespectful. Math, after all, was more than just numbers. It was about engaging with the subject, understanding its beauty, its challenges, its power. Danny wasn't showing any of that. Mr. Reed tried to ignore it. He focused on the rest of the class, giving them the benefit of the doubt that maybe Danny was simply having an off day. But as the minutes passed, he couldn't shake the growing irritation. Every time he glanced at the back corner of the room, Danny was either staring at his phone or doodling in his notebook, his face unreadable. Mr. Reed's patience was wearing thin. Finally, he decided to act. "Vance," Mr. Reed said, his voice sharp and commanding. Danny's head snapped up, his eyes locking onto Mr. Reed's, but there was no real acknowledgement in his expression. "Are you with us today? You seem a little distracted." The class fell into a sudden silence, the buzz of background chatter evaporating as all eyes turned to Danny. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, eyes flickering toward his phone, and then back at Mr. Reed, who was waiting for a response. "I'm working," Danny muttered, his voice barely above a whisper, as though he were trying to make himself invisible again. "Working," Mr. Reed repeated, his tone cutting through the air like a blade. "Is that what you call it? I don't see you doing anything remotely close to engaging with the lesson." Danny's face flushed, but he said nothing. His fingers idly tapped the edge of his desk. His reaction only served to fuel Mr. Reed's irritation. "You've aced every test, but I'm beginning to wonder if it means anything at all when you don't even bother to show any interest. You might be doing the homework, but you're not participating. You're just here to get by, and I don't tolerate that." Mr. Reed's gaze locked with Danny's, and for a brief moment, The room seemed to hold its breath. "Let's see if you can handle something a little more challenging, shall we?" Mr. Reed said, his lips curling into a thin smile. Without waiting for a response, he turned to the whiteboard and wrote a complex equation in front of the class, one that would require more than a simple answer. It was long and convoluted, filled with fractions, exponents, and variables that twisted in every direction. This wasn't just any problem, it was a test of patience and skill. The students looked at each other, nervous glances exchanged. Even the most confident students could feel the weight of the equation. But Mr. Reed wasn't looking at them. His eyes were fixed on Danny. "I expect you to solve this, Vance," he said, his voice suddenly cold and commanding. "Right now." The room grew even quieter. The tension in the air was palpable. Mr. Reed wasn't one to give second chances, and the challenge was as much about proving a point as it was about testing Danny's abilities. Danny hesitated for a moment, his gaze blinking nervously between the equation and Mr. Reed's expectant stare. He had no doubt the problem was difficult but not impossible. In fact, he was already starting to mentally break it down. But the pressure of the moment, the weight of the entire class watching him, made his palms sweat. He could feel the heat rising in his face. This wasn't just about solving an equation. This was about proving himself, and that was the last thing Danny wanted to do. He had spent the past few years perfecting the art of blending into the background. He didn't want attention, especially not now. The last thing he wanted was to stand out, to be the center of the storm. But Mr. Reed's challenge, the deliberate way he'd called him out, left Danny with no choice. The room was watching, waiting for him to either rise to the occasion or fail miserably. And for Danny, failure was the most unbearable option. He stood, his legs slightly shaky, and walked to the front of the room. The chalk felt unfamiliar in his hands, the weight of it suddenly heavy as he approached the board. The equation loomed larger than it ever had in his mind. Solve it. Danny could feel the eyes of the class on him, could feel the quiet whispers of expectation. There were only two choices now, fail or do it. There was no middle ground. As he picked up the chalk, he let out a long breath, steadying himself. The room was silent. Mr. Reed was watching, a small, barely perceptible smirk on his face. But as Danny wrote down his first step, something clicked. The numbers fell into place like pieces of a puzzle. The more he wrote, the more he found himself getting lost in the rhythm of it, the complexity of the problem dissolving before him. And then, to the surprise of everyone, including Mr. Reed, Danny finished the equation neatly and without a mistake. He stepped back from the board, his heart racing, his mind still processing the sudden rush of success. He hadn't just solved the problem, he had owned it. The class was silent for a moment. Mr. Reed's eyes narrowed, studying the equation on the board. Then slowly, his lips twisted into something resembling a smile. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it was there. "Well, Vance," Mr. Reed said, his voice low and measured, "it seems you've got some potential after all." Danny didn't respond. He just returned to his seat, his hands still shaking, slightly from the adrenaline. The tension in the room slowly began to dissipate, but the moment had left an impression, a reminder that Danny Vance was not the slacker Mr. Reed had assumed him to be, but this was only the beginning. The atmosphere in room 402 grew tense the moment Danny stood up from his desk. His heart raced, each beat a drum that reverberated through his chest. The hum of whispered conversations around him seemed to fade, replaced by the sharp click of his shoes against the floor. The chalkboard, once a neutral space for mathematical musings, now felt like a looming mountain he had no choice but to climb. As Danny made his way to the front, he could feel the weight of the class's gaze on him, more piercing than 100 sets of eyes. There was no escape. The trap had been set, and it was too late to turn back. Mr. Reed had a predatory look. On his face, an expression that bordered on amusement. He didn't hide his disdain for Danny's lack of engagement. This wasn't just about a math problem anymore. This was personal. "Go ahead, Vance," Mr. Reed said with a voice that dripped with condescension. Show us what you've got. Danny hesitated for just a moment, his eyes flicking nervously over the complex mess of symbols Mr. Reed had written on the board. The equation was like nothing he had ever seen before, a tangled web of algebraic expressions, variables, and fractions, stacked on top of each other in an impossibly intricate arrangement. It was obvious that this wasn't a problem meant to be solved in a matter of minutes. The students knew it, Mr. Reed knew it, and Danny knew it. In the back of his mind, he could hear the whispers, students muttering to one another, some with nervous chuckles, others with outright mockery. "He doesn't even know where to start," one of them murmured. Another added, "This is going to be good." A few students exchanged skeptical glances, their eyes darting from the equation on the board to Danny's tense posture. Even the most confident among them, like Jennifer and Adam, looked unsure. The equation was absurd, far beyond what any student in this class could reasonably solve. But that's exactly what Mr. Reed was counting on. He had pushed Danny into a corner, forcing him to either succeed and defy expectations or fail miserably in front of his peers. As the seconds ticked, Danny's internal conflict intensified. The weight of the situation pressed down on him. He could feel his palms growing clammy, his fingers twitching at his sides. He didn't want this attention. He didn't want to be in the spotlight. Danny was the quiet one, the observer, the student who faded into the background so he wouldn't have to endure the anxiety of being seen. But something else flickered in him, something deeper, something that pushed back against the wave of panic threatening to swallow him whole. It wasn't just about avoiding humiliation anymore. It was about proving something, both to himself and to Mr. Reed. The teacher had called him out, had set up this impossible challenge, as if Danny was nothing more than a failure waiting to happen. "You can't let him win," Danny thought, the words echoing through his mind like a rallying cry. Not like this. He took a breath, steadying himself. The clock on the wall ticked louder now, the seconds stretching and stretching until they felt like an eternity. He felt the heat of the chalk in his hand as he picked it up, the familiar sensation grounding him for just a moment. It was strange. He had solved tougher problems than this in his spare time. But now, in front of his classmates, the challenge was more than just about the math. It was about silencing the doubts and proving that he was more than what Mr. Reed had labeled him. The room had grown silent, save for the soft scrape of chalk on the board as Danny began to write. At first, he hesitated. The equation sprawled in front of him, mocking him with its complexity. But then he remembered the long nights spent delivering pizzas across Brooklyn, the quiet hours when the world had fallen away, and he could focus entirely on solving problems, the rhythm of numbers filling the space around him. Those moments had been his sanctuary, his escape. He had come to see math as something beautiful, something he could lose himself in. The streets might have been noisy and chaotic, but in his mind, math was always peaceful, always clear, and right now, he needed that clarity. Danny's chalk moved swiftly, almost instinctively, as he began breaking down the equation in his head. His fingers didn't falter as they wrote, the numbers and fractions beginning to make sense in a way that only he could see. He was no longer thinking about the classroom, the eyes of his peers, or Mr. Reed's gaze. He was lost in the problem, unraveling it piece by piece. The class watched in stunned silence as Danny worked, his movements fluid and sure. For a few moments there was nothing but the scratch of chalk on the board and the occasional click of a pen. The students shifted in their seats, exchanging confused glances. What was happening? Danny was solving it. But how? Mr. Reed's expression shifted from smug amusement to something more guarded. His eyes narrowed as he studied Danny's work, and for the first time there was a flicker of uncertainty on his face. It was subtle, but it was there. The teacher had assumed that Danny would falter, that he would be exposed as a fraud, that his indifference would finally catch up with him. But Danny wasn't faltering. If anything, he seemed to be gaining momentum. With a few swift strokes, Danny finished the last step of the equation, and there it was, the solution. Neat, elegant, perfect. The classroom was still silent. Danny stood back, his breath heavy in his chest. He didn't look at Mr. Reed, he didn't look at anyone. He just stepped away from the board and returned to his seat, his legs shaky and his hands still gripping the edge of the desk to steady himself. The room was quiet, so quiet that even the hum of the fluorescent lights above seemed deafening. Finally, Mr. Reed cleared his throat, breaking the stillness. "Well," he said, his voice strained, "that was unexpected." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Mr. Reed's gaze was sharp, calculating. He didn't like being outsmarted, especially not by a student who had always seemed to be nothing more than a passive observer. But here Danny was, standing in front of him, having solved the unsolvable problem with the kind of ease that only a few of the greatest minds could achieve. Mr. Reed didn't say anything more for a moment. He didn't have to. The class was buzzing with energy now, students turning to each other in shock, disbelief, and awe. Danny hadn't just solved the equation, he had shattered their expectations. For a fleeting moment, Danny felt something rare, a surge of pride, a quiet recognition of his own brilliance. But that feeling was quickly replaced by an overwhelming wave of self-consciousness. He hadn't done it for the praise, he hadn't done it to impress anyone, he had done it because he couldn't let Mr. Reed and the world see him as a failure. As the students slowly began to murmur amongst themselves, Mr. Reed's cold, calculating eyes remained fixed on Danny. He said nothing, but the challenge in his gaze was unmistakable. This wasn't over. The trap had been set, and Danny had stepped right into it. But now that he had shown what he could do, the real game was just beginning. Danny stood at the chalkboard, his mind racing. The equation loomed in front of him, an intricate tangle of variables, fractions, and algebraic expressions. But it wasn't a threat, not to him. To everyone else, it was an insurmountable challenge. To Danny, it was just another puzzle, one of many he had solved on the quiet streets of Brooklyn, late at night between pizza deliveries. The whispers from his classmates faded into a dull murmur, like a distant echo. He could feel their eyes on him, their expectation and skepticism pressing against his back, but it didn't matter. The classroom, once filled with noise and tension, melted away. Danny's focus sharpened. The equation on the board wasn't just a random assortment of symbols. It was a language he understood instinctively. His hand gripped the chalk, and the world outside of that narrow space disappeared. His mind shifted gears. It was almost like a second language. It had always been this way for him, ever since he was a kid, sitting in his mother's small apartment, poring over math puzzles when his friends were out playing. His mother, tired from her long shifts, had always taken the time to sit down with him, working through puzzles, equations, and the occasional geometry problem to help him understand the beauty in numbers. It wasn't just homework. It wasn't just an afterthought. It was their moment, one of the few they had together, and that had been the start of it. He didn't know it then, but something had clicked in his brain. Something had clicked in his heart. Math wasn't something that he just understood. It was something that made sense in a way that words and emotions sometimes didn't. There was always a solution, always a pattern to follow if you were patient enough to find it. As he stood there, his fingers began to move automatically, tracing arcs and lines on the board, breaking down the equation. The numbers swirled in his mind, abstract and fluid, like pieces of a puzzle waiting to be snapped into place. He saw the problem from all angles at once. The fractions were easy to manipulate. He broke them down, simplifying each one with a kind of practiced ease. Variables became symbols that he could see through, their true value revealing itself to him like an open book. His breath slowed, steadying. The chalk in his hand seemed to move of its own accord, sketching out lines faster than his mind could consciously follow. The algebraic structures, once intimidating and overwhelming, now seemed like a game, an exciting challenge to decipher, and one he had been playing for years. The classroom around him became irrelevant. He wasn't performing for anyone anymore. The laughter and the whispers that had echoed in his ears only moments before now faded away completely. All that mattered was the problem on the board. The noise in his mind had quieted. He could feel his brain running through complex algorithms, organizing information at lightning speed. His thoughts whirred through mathematical frameworks, recalling formulas and abstract concepts as if they were second nature. It wasn't just about knowing the right steps. It was about seeing patterns that others couldn't. It was about finding the key that unlocked the equation's complexity. His hand moved swiftly across the board, almost too fast for the eye to follow. He didn't have to think about the next move. His fingers seemed to already know where they needed to go. With each stroke, he isolated variables, combined like terms, simplified fractions. The messy, complicated expression started to take shape, like an image slowly emerging from a pile of scattered puzzle pieces. A small flicker of satisfaction curled in his chest, but he quickly dismissed it. There was no time for that. The problem wasn't finished yet. He was still in the middle of solving it, still in the midst of deciphering its deeper meaning. The room was completely silent now. Danny could feel the eyes of his classmates on him, but they were no longer a distraction. They weren't even a presence. He was in his own world, one where math wasn't a chore to be done for a grade. It was a language he could speak fluently. In that moment, he was fully alive, fully present in the solution. A rush of adrenaline surged through his veins. It wasn't about proving Mr. Reed wrong, though that was a nice bonus. It was about the puzzle itself, the feeling of his mind. Working through the pieces, the satisfaction of seeing the final answer begin to emerge. Each step forward in solving the equation was like reaching the summit of a mountain he'd climbed countless times before, but never quite the same way. His movements grew quicker as he neared the end of the equation. The variables fell into place like dominoes. The fractions lined up, and the abstract notations in the original problem started to make sense. The clarity Danny felt was almost physical, a lightness in his chest, as if a weight had been lifted. He was so close now. One more step, one final simplification, and then it would all be over. His chalk stopped moving. There it was. The answer. Perfect, clean. The equation, once an unyielding mess of complexity, had been transformed into something simple, something beautiful, almost like a work of art. He stepped back from the board, his breath coming in shallow bursts. His heart was still racing, but it wasn't from fear. It was from exhilaration. He had done it. He had solved it. Not for Mr. Reed, not for anyone but himself. And as Danny's mind slowly returned to reality, the sharp buzz of tension in the air returned with it. The classroom was still silent, still waiting, but now the silence was different. There was an undercurrent of disbelief in the air, an almost palpable sense of awe that hung between the students and the teacher alike. Mr. Reed's piercing eyes were locked on the solution, his expression unreadable. Danny barely acknowledged. The class, his head was spinning. He had solved the impossible equation, and yet it didn't feel like a victory, at least not in the way that everyone else might have seen it. No applause, no cheers, just the quiet knowledge that he had done. Something that nobody else had expected. A sense of quiet pride settled in his chest, but it was fleeting. There was something else at play here, something beyond just proving Mr. Reed wrong, beyond just answering the question. He hadn't been performing for anyone else. This wasn't about proving anything to the class. It was about proving something to himself. And as Danny walked back to his seat, trying to avoid the stares of the students who were still processing what they had just witnessed, a thought lingered in his mind, pushing all other distractions aside. I belong here. For the first time in a long while, Danny felt like he had just claimed his rightful place in the world of numbers. The classroom was filled with a low hum of anticipation, a buzz that seemed to vibrate against the walls. As Danny stood at the board, hands gripping the chalk, a few students still openly whispered, their voices muffled by the echoes of Mr. Reed's stern silence. The teacher stood in the front of the room, arms crossed, eyes fixed on Danny with an expression that could only be described as expectant, watching for failure. Danny had been the perfect candidate for the challenge, an average student in his eyes, one who could easily be humiliated. The equation seemed too complicated, too intricate for someone like Danny. Most students, even those who were genuinely talented, were beginning to doubt that he could make any headway. Some laughed under their breath, while others exchanged amused glances. A group of girls in the front whispered about how long they thought it would take him to break down under pressure. "He doesn't even know where to start," one of them muttered, her voice carrying in the brief silence. Another girl snickered. "This is gonna be good." At first, Danny felt it, their judgment, the way they watched him, waiting for him to flounder. He could feel their eyes boring into the back of his head, their expectations pulling him down, trying to crush him beneath the weight of their doubts. The pressure was suffocating. Yet there was also something else. He was already slipping into that state of concentration, the place where the world outside didn't exist. He barely noticed the smirks that played on their faces, the quick glances exchanged between the students, the markers in his hand, the sharp edges of the chalk, the marks on the board. They all seemed irrelevant, only channels to something much deeper inside him. But as the minutes ticked by, something shifted. Slowly, the laughter began to fade, becoming more sporadic. At first, it was a simple flicker, a few seconds of silence between snickers as the students began to notice. Their eyes, once mocking, now drifted toward the board as Danny's chalk moved with speed and precision, breaking down the equation. What's he doing?" one student whispered in disbelief, leaning forward in their seat, squinting at the board. A boy at the back of the room, whose name Danny didn't even know, stood up from his chair, squinting to get a better look. "Is he actually solving it?" he murmured, his tone one of surprise. The classroom, once a cauldron of whispered judgments and skepticism, grew quiet. The energy shifted from doubt to intrigue, and the previously indifferent students now watched with wide eyes as Danny's movements became sharper and more purposeful. Danny wasn't just solving the equation, he was rewriting its entire structure with a level of ease and grace that didn't belong in this classroom. His hands moved as if they were part of the equation itself, pulling variables out of the air and manipulating them with the elegance of a symphony conductor. There was no hesitation now. His chalk streaked across the board like an artist painting a canvas. His mind worked through algorithms and patterns, each step building toward a solution that seemed so far beyond what anyone had imagined possible. The first real reaction came from Kyle, the class clown, who had been the loudest in his dismissiveness toward Danny's abilities. "Wait a minute, this can't be right." His voice was no longer dripping with sarcasm. Instead, there was a strange uncertainty to it. Danny's chalk paused as he adjusted one of the variables, but the movement was brief, just long enough to keep the class on edge. It was as if the whole room was collectively holding its breath. Could this be real? Could Danny actually do it? By now, the last snickers had died away. The air in the room was thick with disbelief. Even Mr. Reed, who had leaned back against his desk with an expression of almost smug satisfaction, seemed to tense. His eyes flickered from the equation to Danny, his lips tightening into a thin line as if he was trying to contain the surprise he felt. The class was caught in a strange, suspended moment. The students who had initially written Danny off as just another average kid were now looking at him as though they had never really seen him before. Mrs. Collins, a quiet figure who had been sitting at the back of the room, carefully observing Danny's progress, was the first to notice the brilliance in his work. She wasn't one of the students. She was a visitor, a teacher's assistant from the school district, sitting in to observe and assist where needed. But her gaze was fixed intently on Danny. She had seen students struggle through math problems before, but what Danny was doing wasn't just solving an equation. He wasn't just answering the question. He was transforming the entire problem into something entirely new, almost as if he were deciphering a code others could not even see. Her eyes widened, and she leaned forward slightly in her chair, watching closely. Danny's movements on the board were fluid and precise. He wasn't just solving the equation, he was unraveling it, peeling back layers of complexity that no one else had thought to examine. Mrs. Collins recognized it almost immediately. Danny wasn't just a student who could solve problems. He was someone who could think in ways others could only dream of. As Danny reached the final line of the equation, the classroom held its collective breath. He paused for a moment, scanning the result on the board, as if verifying it against his thoughts. Then, with a confident motion, he wrote the final step, a clean, simple answer that brought the complicated mess to an elegant conclusion. He stepped back, breathing heavily, but there was no joy, no triumphant grin that usually accompanied the end of a complex problem. The room was silent, and the students who had once mocked him now stood in stunned silence. Danny's chest tightened with a strange mixture of relief and discomfort. He had done it. He had solved the equation, but the victory wasn't the triumph he had expected. Instead of feeling elated, he felt exposed. All these eyes, these whispers, these stares, now they all knew. They knew what he had been hiding all along, the part of himself that he had kept in the shadows, the part of him that didn't fit the mold they had all placed him in. The satisfaction he thought he would feel evaporated, replaced by an uncomfortable sense of being seen, of being pulled out from the background and into the harsh light of recognition. He hadn't wanted this. He had just wanted to blend in, to stay invisible, to be just another face in the crowd. But now they knew. Mr. Reed's expression remained hard to read, his eyes flickering from Danny's answer back to the boy himself. He said nothing for a long moment, as if trying to process the result. The tension was palpable, and the class seemed to hang in limbo, waiting for some kind of reaction from the teacher. And then it happened. Mrs. Collins stood up from her chair at the back of the room. Her gaze locked onto Mr. Reed's, and for the first time she spoke with certainty. "I think you owe Danny an apology." The room froze. Mr. Reed glanced at her, his eyebrows slightly raised in surprise. Then his eyes shifted back to Danny. He opened his mouth, but the words that escaped were not what anyone had expected. "Well," Mr. Reed said slowly, his voice quieter now, almost begrudgingly, "I guess I was wrong." The air in the room shifted again, this time with something resembling respect. For a long moment, Mr. Reed stood frozen at the front of the room, his gaze fixed on the board where Danny had just finished solving the impossible equation. The air in the room had shifted. What was once an atmosphere thick with mockery and doubt had transformed into one of disbelief and stunned silence. The entire class seemed to collectively hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable judgment to come from their teacher. Mr. Reed had always prided himself on being unshakable, confident in his ability to gauge students' abilities. But now, as he stood there, staring at Danny's work, he felt an unsettling jolt of uncertainty creeping into his gut. Danny had done it. The equation was flawless. Every step Danny had taken on that board, every variable he had isolated, every fraction he had simplified was perfect. It wasn't just a solution. It was an intricate and sophisticated path through a labyrinth of mathematical theory that not many in this class, including Mr. Reed himself, could have navigated with such ease. It was almost as if the equation was alive in Danny's hands, bending to his will. Each symbol was placed with meticulous precision, each operation executed with the confidence of someone who had been working in the realm of higher mathematics for years. Mr. Reed's eyes scanned over the board again, his mind racing as he attempted to catch up with the brilliance of what he was seeing. No mistakes, no miscalculations. He blinked, feeling the burn of disbelief in his chest, the creeping realization that this wasn't some fluke, some lucky guess or an accident. Danny had solved it. He could feel the weight of the classroom's gaze on him. As he slowly took a few steps toward the board, as if his body was moving on its own, drawn to the evidence of his error. His footsteps were measured, deliberate, as if each one was a step toward a reality he hadn't quite prepared himself for. The students remained quiet, even the most skeptical ones, as Mr. Reed came to a halt in front of Danny's work. His eyes traced over each line, each calculation, looking for the inevitable mistake that could justify his earlier belief that Danny wasn't capable of such a feat. But there was nothing. Nothing at all. I can't believe it, Mr. Reed muttered under his breath, more to himself than to anyone else. Danny, standing there in the spotlight, felt the weight of those words like 1,000 tons pressing down on his chest. His palms were clammy, his breath coming in shallow bursts. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected to succeed, let alone in front of an entire class. But even worse than the unexpected success was the attention. He had wanted nothing more than to blend in, to be invisible. And now the whole world seemed to be staring at him. The students' reactions were impossible to ignore. There was no more laughter, no more mocking whispers. The room was eerily silent, each person holding their breath as Mr. Reed continued to scrutinize the board, his face unreadable. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Mr. Reed stepped back from the board, his hands held loosely at his sides. His expression was one Danny had never seen before, something close to awe, mixed with reluctant admiration. The skepticism that had been etched on Mr. Reed's face for the entire lesson had melted away, replaced by something else entirely. This is correct, Mr. Reed finally said, his voice low and begrudging. His eyes didn't leave the board as he spoke, almost as if he were afraid to meet Danny's gaze. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of his admission. "You've solved it." A brief pause followed. Danny's heart thudded painfully in his chest, the sound echoing in his ears. He was still processing the gravity of the moment, still trying to figure out how to respond when the students began to react. The first to break the silence was Kyle, the class clown, who had always been one of Danny's harshest critics. He stood up suddenly, his eyes wide with disbelief, and a grin stretched across his face. "Holy shit, dude," he said, his voice full of awe. "You really did it." And then, like a dam breaking, the rest of the class erupted. Applause followed almost immediately, the sound of clapping hands filling the room, reverberating off the walls. Danny could hardly comprehend what was happening. This wasn't his world. This wasn't how he'd expected things to unfold. The attention was suffocating. He stood there awkwardly, his shoulders tense, unsure of how to process the sudden shift in perception. His fingers tightened around the chalk as he tried to keep his composure, but his mind was reeling. For a brief second, he thought about running out of the room, escaping this attention that had fallen upon him so unexpectedly. He'd always been invisible, always tried to stay under the radar, but now he was the center of it all. The clapping didn't stop. Some students who had barely acknowledged him before were now cheering his name, nodding in approval, as if they'd just witnessed a miracle. It was disorienting. He wasn't sure if he wanted to sink into the floor or bask in the fleeting moments of their newfound respect. Mr. Reed, still standing at the front of the room, watched the scene unfold with a complicated mix of emotions. His eyes flickered back to Danny, then quickly shifted away. The teacher's internal struggle was palpable. He had been so sure of Danny's inadequacy, so convinced that the kid was nothing more than a pizza delivery boy with no interest in academics. But now, as he stood there, feeling the weight of his misjudgment, he knew he had to confront his own biases. He turned toward the class and raised his hand, calling for silence. The students, who were still clapping and murmuring excitedly, slowly quieted, their attention once again on him. "All right, enough," Mr. Reed said, his voice a little hoarse but steady. He looked directly at Danny, his gaze softer than it had ever been before. "Let's get one thing straight here. Danny has just proven me wrong in the most impressive way possible. I won't deny it." His voice wavered slightly as he spoke, the weight of his admission pressing down on him. "This kid just solved a problem that none of us could touch. I made an assumption about him, and I was wrong." Danny's heart raced, but the words, though uncomfortable, carried a certain weight. They meant something, an acknowledgement that Danny wasn't just another anonymous student. He wasn't just the pizza boy. "I apologize," Mr. Reed said quietly, "but it was enough. You've earned my respect, Danny." The words lingered in the air, hanging heavy with finality. The room was still, the earlier buzz of excitement now settling into something more subdued, yet charged with a new sense of respect. Danny stood still, his mind still spinning, unable to fully absorb the gravity of what had just happened. As the applause finally faded, the reality began to sink in. Danny wasn't invisible anymore. The class had seen him, acknowledged him, and in some strange, unexpected way, respected him. And though the attention was uncomfortable, there was also something else, something strange and undeniable. For the first time in his life, he felt like he had earned a place in this world, a place that no longer depended on blending in. The math equation on the board wasn't just a solution to a problem. It was a turning point. Danny's life, his identity, had just been irrevocably altered. As soon as the bell rang, signaling the end of the class, the room erupted into a buzz of excitement. Students who had once barely given Danny a passing glance were suddenly swarming him, their voices a cacophony of questions and praise. For a few moments, it felt like he was trapped in the eye of a storm, his classmates circling around him, eager to talk, to ask, to understand. "Wait, you actually solved that?" Kyle, the class clown who had mocked him earlier, was the first to break through the crowd. His tone was a mix of disbelief and awe, his earlier skepticism replaced by genuine respect. "How did you do that? What was your secret?" Danny, still standing at the front of the room, found himself unable to move. The attention was suffocating, pressing in on him from all sides. It was like a tidal wave of questions, curiosity and admiration that he had never asked for. He wanted to shrink into the shadows, to escape back to the comfort of his low-key existence, but that wasn't going to happen. Not now. He shifted uncomfortably, looking around for some escape, but there was no easy way out. He didn't know how to answer them. How could he explain that he had been solving equations like that for years, alone in the quiet of his apartment, late into the night between pizza deliveries? How could he admit that his mother's late-night math games had shaped his mind, that the hours spent alone with his thoughts had made him a quiet genius in a world that wasn't ready to see him as such? A girl from the front of the class, Emily, leaned in with wide eyes, practically bouncing with curiosity. "Seriously, Danny, you're like a math genius or something." Her voice was almost giddy, and it made Danny cringe inwardly. "Yeah, he's the pizza prodigy now," Kyle added with a grin, as though the nickname had already been decided. He elbowed Danny lightly, clearly enjoying the spectacle. "You gonna help me out with the next test, bro? 'Cause I can barely add 2 numbers without getting lost." The nickname stuck almost immediately, and by the time the crowd around Danny had begun to thin, everyone seemed to be calling him the pizza prodigy, with varying degrees of admiration and joking. Danny couldn't decide if he was flattered or horrified. It was as if, in the span of a single math equation, he had transformed from an invisible student to a sudden local celebrity, and it was more than he could handle. His mind buzzed with conflicting emotions, a gnawing discomfort with the attention, a touch of pride for having solved the equation, and a deep-rooted desire to remain anonymous, to slip back into his quiet life, where he wasn't forced to stand out. That was when Mr. Reed stepped into the crowd, his presence instantly clearing the way. The students, still buzzing from the excitement, silenced themselves when they saw the teacher. He walked purposefully toward Danny, his expression unreadable, but filled with a certain intensity. The students parted, some backing away slowly, others continuing to whisper amongst themselves in hushed tones. "Danny," Mr. Reed said, his voice surprisingly low, his tone somewhat softer than usual. "A moment, please." The students quickly scattered, but not without shooting curious glances over their shoulders. The air between Danny and Mr. Reed seemed charged, as if this conversation held more weight than anything that had just happened in the classroom. Danny turned to face his teacher, his stomach twisting with the awkwardness of it all. Yeah." Mr. Reed looked at him. For a long moment, his brow furrowing slightly. "You never mentioned that you had these kinds of skills," he began, his voice heavy with an almost begrudging admiration. "I've been teaching for years, Danny, and I've seen a lot of students, some brilliant, some barely passing. But you, I assumed you didn't care." "About math? You barely participated, you never spoke up, and you always acted like you were just passing through the motions." Danny shifted uncomfortably. "I just don't like drawing attention to myself," he muttered, his voice barely above. A whisper. "I never wanted to stand out, you know. I just do my thing and keep to myself." Mr. Reed's expression was unreadable for a moment, and Danny could feel the teacher's sharp eyes assessing him, as if trying to piece together some puzzle that was only now beginning to make sense. "I get that," Mr. Reed finally said, though his voice was softer now, almost understanding. "But today, I don't get it. Why haven't you ever shared this talent of yours? You could have easily been one of the top students in my class, Danny, and yet you chose to hide, to keep it all to yourself." "I didn't want to be treated differently," Danny explained, his voice steady but filled with quiet resolve. "People like me, the quiet ones, they don't stand out. I didn't want anyone to think I was trying to show off, or worse, that I was just some weird freak." Mr. Reed stared at him for a moment longer, the lines on his face deepening as he considered Danny's words. "So you've been hiding this ability because you were afraid of being treated like an outsider?" Danny nodded, biting the inside of his cheek. "Yeah, I mean, I'm not exactly a math guy. I'm just me. I don't need people looking at me like I'm some freak just because I know how to do something." Mr. Reed took a step back, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if something was clicking into place. "You've never shared your talents because you don't want to be different," he mused, more to himself than to Danny. Then he looked directly at Danny. "But the thing is, Danny, you are different. That's what makes you special. You have an ability that sets you apart from everyone else in this room." Danny felt his cheeks flush with discomfort, his gaze falling to the floor. "I don't know if I'm special. I just wanted to be normal." The teacher's expression softened, his stern demeanor momentarily replaced by something more empathetic. "Normal's overrated, kid, and you're not just normal. You're capable of things most people would never even dream of. And that's why I'm saying this. You don't have to hide anymore." Danny wasn't sure if he was ready to hear this, or if he was even ready to believe it. He had always known he was good at math, but he had never thought of himself as something extraordinary. He was just a pizza delivery guy, after all, a regular high school kid trying to make it through the day without drawing attention, but standing. Here, in front of Mr. Reed, with the weight of his words hanging in the air, Danny felt something begin to shift inside him. Maybe it was time to stop hiding. Maybe it was time to stop blending into the background. But could he truly embrace who he was? "I don't want to be treated differently," Danny said, though this time there was less uncertainty in his voice. "But I'm also not going to hide who I am anymore." Mr. Reed smiled faintly, a glimmer of approval in his eyes. "That's what I like to hear." He gave Danny one last look, as if weighing the options before him. "We'll see how far this takes you, Danny, but you've got something special. Don't let it go to waste." As the teacher turned to leave, Danny stood there, still processing everything that had just happened. The class had witnessed him solve the impossible. He had proven something to them, but more importantly, he had proven something to himself. He wasn't just a pizza boy. He wasn't just a quiet kid trying to avoid attention. Danny was capable of so much more than he had ever given himself credit for. And as he walked out of the classroom, still hearing the faint echoes of pizza, prodigy from his classmates, Danny realized that this was only the beginning. The bell had already rung for the end of the school day, and the halls of the high school were beginning to empty as students filed out, eager to head home. The day had been surreal for Danny. He had gone from being the quiet kid at the back of the room to the talk of the school. And now, as he stood at the front of the classroom, waiting for Mr. Reed to make his move, he couldn't help but feel like he was standing at the edge of a cliff. Mr. Reed was standing by his desk, his arms folded across his chest, his brow furrowed in that familiar way that always made Danny think the teacher was either deep in thought or about to give him a hard time. The students had dispersed, the noise of their chatter fading into the distance. The classroom felt quieter now, almost too quiet. And Danny, still feeling the weight of the attention, found himself wondering if he could just disappear back into the background, But then Mr. Reed spoke. "You did something impressive today," Mr. Reed said, his voice much softer than usual. Danny looked up at him, trying to gauge his expression, but it was unreadable. "I'm sure you're aware of that. But what you might not realize is that you've got potential, real potential, Danny." Danny shifted uncomfortably, looking down at his feet. He could already feel the discomfort creeping in. The last thing he wanted was more attention. "Thanks. But," he started, but Mr. Reed cut him off. No, I'm not just giving you a pat on the back. I'm serious." Mr. Reed stepped forward, walking to the front of the room and placing a folded brochure on the desk. "I've been thinking about you, and I've decided that you belong in the advanced math program. We're starting an after-school group, and I think you'd be a perfect fit." Danny froze. His mind scrambled for words, but they didn't come. Advanced math program. Him. He'd never considered himself someone who belonged in a program like that. Sure, he had solved an equation no one else could, but that didn't mean he was ready for something that could change his life. He wasn't even sure he wanted it. "Wait, what?" Danny asked, his voice strained with disbelief. "You want me to join the advanced math program? I'm just some kid who delivers pizzas, Mr. Reed. I don't belong in a program like that." Mr. Reed's gaze softened for a moment, but there was still that air of conviction about him. "You're selling yourself short. The way you solved that equation today, you've got the kind of mind I don't see every day. I've been teaching for over 20 years, and I've seen what real talent looks like. You've got it." Danny shook his head. "But I'm not like those other kids. I don't know if I can keep up with them. I don't know if I'm really cut out for something like that." Mr. Reed's smile was faint, almost sympathetic. "Everyone has doubts. Everyone wonders if they belong. But it's the ones who face those doubts head-on that achieve greatness, Danny. You have a chance to prove something, not to anyone else, but to yourself. The opportunity is there. All you have to do is take it." Danny stood there, staring at the brochure in front of him, his stomach twisted in knots. The thought of being thrust into a new world, where he would be expected to perform at a higher level, where people would look at him and expect something, made him want to retreat. His quiet world had been a safe place. He liked his nights delivering pizzas, his solitary hours with math problems. He could solve equations without anyone looking over his shoulder, without anyone watching his every move. Now he had to decide whether to take a step into the unknown and risk everything. What if he failed? What if he was just a fluke, a one-off, who had solved one impossible equation but couldn't handle the real challenges that awaited him in a place like the advanced program? "I don't know," Danny said quietly, his voice almost lost in the silence of the room. "I don't know if I can do this." Mr. Reed sighed, but it wasn't an exasperated sigh. It was more of a resigned understanding. "It's your choice, Danny, but think about it. You've already shown you can do something special. The question is whether you want to keep it hidden or if you're ready to see how far you can go." With that, Mr. Reed turned to leave, giving Danny space to think. As the door clicked shut behind him, Danny stood frozen, the weight of his teacher's words hanging heavily in the air. That night, Danny sat alone at his kitchen table, the glow of his phone screen illuminating the dark room. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, the hours stretching out as he mulled over Mr. Reed's offer. His mother had gone to bed already, her work at the diner demanding long hours, and his father was away on a business trip, as usual. It was just him, the hum of the fridge, and the quiet, familiar darkness that had been his constant companion. He rubbed his eyes, trying to shake off the exhaustion that lingered from the long shift he had just worked delivering pizzas. But no matter how much he wanted to focus on the equations in front of him, his thoughts kept drifting back to the offer. Mr. Reed had been insistent. The advanced math program, a chance for him to prove himself, to be more than just the quiet kid. The pizza boy, but could he do it? Danny's mind swirled with doubts. He had never wanted to stand out, never wanted to be thrust into the limelight. Solving equations had always been his escape, something he did for himself. He had always found solace in the quiet moments late at night when the world was asleep. and he could simply lose himself in numbers and patterns. That was enough. It was safe. He didn't have to worry about anyone judging him or expecting him to be something he wasn't. And yet, here he was, on the edge of something entirely different. Mr. Reed believed in him. The rest of the class was calling him a genius. They all wanted a piece of him now, wanted his help with their own work, wanted him to show them how he did it. But what if they were all wrong? What if he wasn't really special? What if the moment he stepped into that advanced math program, he would be exposed as a fraud? What if, for the first time in his life, he didn't know the answers? His phone buzzed, breaking his thoughts. A message from his mum. "Great job today, Danny. I'm proud of you." The words were simple, but they hit him harder than he expected. His mom had always been his biggest supporter, even when she worked long hours and barely had time to sit down. She had always been there for him, nurturing his love for math when it was just the two of them, sitting at the kitchen table, solving puzzles late into the night. She had never pushed him to be anything he wasn't, but she had always believed in him. He could hear her voice in his head, gentle but firm. "You can do anything you set your mind to, Danny." But what if he didn't want to set his mind to this? What if it was too much for him? What if stepping into the spotlight would only lead to disappointment? The internal battle raged inside him. His mind raced, trying to find an answer, but no matter how many times he ran through the scenarios, none of them felt right. There was no easy choice, no clear path forward. And then the words of Mr. Reed echoed in his mind. "It's the ones who face those doubts head-on that achieve greatness." Danny let out a slow breath, his heart pounding in his chest. It wasn't about being the best. It wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about facing his fear of failure. It was about proving to himself that he could take this leap, and even if he fell, at least he would have tried. With a sense of resolution, Danny set his phone down. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to hide anymore. The days that followed were a blur. Danny was consumed by the noise in his own mind, as if the world had become a cacophony of voices, all urging him in different directions. It felt like the universe had dropped a bombshell in his lap. And no matter how much he tried to deny it, there was no escaping the reality of the decision he had to make. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Mr. Reed's face, heard the teacher's words. "You have potential, Danny. Don't waste it." By now, Danny had already begun to feel the pressure. The whispers at school had grown louder as the story of his impossible equations spread like wildfire. Everyone seemed to be talking about it. His classmates had given him a new nickname, the Pizza Prodigy. It wasn't flattering, not really. It felt like they were mocking him, even if some of them were genuinely impressed. In every hallway, on every corner, he could hear someone whispering about him. But it wasn't just the attention that weighed on him. It was the expectation. Suddenly, he wasn't just Danny anymore. He was the kid who had solved an equation no one else could touch. The kid who might have a shot at something bigger than pizza deliveries and late-night math puzzles in his bedroom. He was supposed to live up to something. And in the quiet of the night, when he was alone, he found himself asking, "What if I'm not good enough? What if I fail?" But as much as the doubts gnawed at him, there was something else, something stirring deep inside him, a flicker of defiance. Maybe it wasn't about proving anyone else wrong. Maybe it was about proving himself right. Maybe the whole reason he'd been hiding in the shadows for so long was because he was afraid to face the one thing that had always been true. He had potential. Danny wasn't a fluke. He wasn't just the pizza boy, the quiet kid at the back of the classroom. He was more than that. The thought settled in his chest like a weight lifting. He didn't want to spend his life shrinking away from opportunities. He didn't want to keep hiding from the parts of himself that could grow and change. And if he was honest, maybe deep down, he didn't want to be just another face in the crowd. The next day, after school, Danny found himself walking to Mr. Reed's classroom once again. His steps were slow, but there was a sense of determination in his movements that hadn't been there before. The nerves still tightened in his stomach, but they no longer paralyzed him. He was finally ready to face what lay ahead. He knocked on the door. Mr. Reed opened it, looking slightly surprised, though there was a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "Danny," Mr. Reed greeted him, stepping aside to let him in. "What's on your mind?" Danny stood in the doorway, a bit uncertain, but he was no longer that same kid who shied away from confrontation. He took a deep breath, exhaled slowly, and looked Mr. Reed in the eye. "I've thought about it," Danny said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I've thought about what you said, and I want to join the advanced math program." For a brief moment, Mr. Reed said nothing. His expression shifted slightly, a mix of surprise and approval, before he nodded as though he had been expecting this answer all along. There was something in his eyes, a glimmer of respect, maybe even pride. "You've made a good choice," Mr. Reed said simply. "I knew you'd come around. You've got the talent, Danny. It's time you let the world see it." Danny felt his heart thud against his ribcage. There was still a little part of him that wanted to turn around, to walk out the door and keep living the way he had before, comfortable in his quiet routine, invisible to the world. But there was another part of him, a stronger part, that wanted to prove something, not just to the people who doubted him, but to himself. He wasn't going to hide anymore. "Okay," Danny said, his voice firm now, a hint of resolve creeping in. "I'll do it." Mr. Reed smiled, a rare, genuine smile. "Good. We'll start next week. I'll have the details sent to you. You're going to do great things, Danny. I have no doubt about that." The handshake that followed was firm. It wasn't just a formal gesture. For Danny, it symbolized something more. It was the moment when he stopped being the kid who hid in the background and became someone who took control of his future. For the first time, he wasn't afraid of what might come next. He was ready for it. As Danny walked out of the classroom, a new sense of clarity washed over him. He had taken the first step. No more hiding, no more doubting. From now on, he was going to be someone who faced the challenges, someone who rose to the occasion, not someone who shrank away from it. He didn't know exactly what the future held. He wasn't naive enough to think everything would be easy, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let fear control him anymore. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. When he got home, he found his mother in the kitchen working on dinner, her tired eyes brightening when she saw him walk in. "How was school?" she asked, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Danny smiled. "It was a little crazy, but I've made a decision." She raised an eyebrow. "Oh? And what's that?" "I'm going to join the advanced math program," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. "Mr. Reed offered me a spot, and I'm going to take it." His mother paused for a moment, as if she was processing the words, and then a smile spread across her face. "Danny," she said, her voice full of pride, "I'm so proud of you. You've always had this potential. I knew you could do it." For the first time in a long time, Danny felt like he was exactly where he needed to be, not hidden away, not blending into the background. He was moving forward, and it felt right. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of new experiences. Danny settled into the advanced math program faster than he had anticipated. It was difficult, challenging, and demanding in ways that he had never experienced before. But every problem he solved, every equation he tackled, confirmed what he had already known deep down. He wasn't just a pizza boy, and he wasn't just a kid who had solved a single equation. He was someone who belonged here. And as he began to thrive in this new environment, he realized something even more important. This wasn't just about math. It was about taking chances. It was about stepping into the unknown and realizing that sometimes the greatest discoveries lie on the other side of fear. Danny wasn't sure where this new journey would take him, but for the first time, he was okay with that. He was ready for whatever came next, and that was enough. The final days of the semester flew by faster than Danny could have ever expected. He had become something he never thought possible, a student in the advanced math program, and with each passing day, the world he had once been so terrified to enter started to feel more and more like his own. He was no longer a ghost in the back of the room, not a quiet observer, but an active participant in something bigger than himself. It wasn't easy. The problems grew more complex, the solutions more elusive. But with every challenge, he felt a sense of satisfaction when he solved a particularly difficult equation, or when he pushed through the mental barriers that had once made him doubt himself. He had come a long way from the pizza boy who never wanted to be noticed. But the transformation wasn't just academic. He had learned to trust himself, to let go of the fear of failure. For the first time, Danny felt like he was in control of his destiny. He didn't have all the answers. No one did. But he knew that he wasn't going to shrink back anymore. He was going to take on whatever came his way, one step at a time. Danny's relationship with Mr. Reed had evolved too. Where there had once been suspicion, there was now mutual respect. Mr. Reed wasn't the same intimidating teacher who had made it his mission to expose Danny's weaknesses. Instead, he had become a mentor, someone who pushed him not just to excel, but to realize his full potential. One afternoon, as Danny was packing up his things after another intense session in the program, Mr. Reed approached him, his usual stern expression replaced by something softer, something like pride. "You're doing well, Danny," Mr. Reed said, his voice quieter than usual. "You've come a long way from the kid who tried to disappear in the back of the room." Danny smiled, a little sheepish, but grateful for the recognition. "I guess I'm finally starting to believe that I can do it." "You always could," Mr. Reed replied. "The only thing holding you back was you." Danny nodded, the truth of Mr. Reed's words settling in. He had always been the one in his own way. Fear had been his biggest obstacle, and now he knew how to face it. He had been given a gift, but the real challenge was what came next, what he would do with that gift. The bell rang, signaling the end of class, and Danny gathered his things. As he stepped into the hallway, he saw his classmates, some of whom had once called him the pizza prodigy, now giving him a nod of recognition, not as some joke or novelty, but as someone worthy of respect. It wasn't just the math that had changed. It was the way he carried himself, the way he held his head a little higher than before, the way he stepped into the future with confidence rather than uncertainty. Back at home, things had shifted as well. His mother still worked long hours, but now Danny saw the pride in her eyes whenever she looked at him. She hadn't pressured him, but she had always believed in him. And now, as he sat at the kitchen table, textbooks open, his future felt like something he could shape. No longer the quiet boy hiding behind pizza deliveries, he had become someone who would eventually, perhaps even soon, make a name for himself in the world of mathematics. "You're growing up, Danny," his mother would often say, a hint of nostalgia in her voice. "I'm proud of you, son. I always knew you had it in you." Danny's heart swelled with emotion every time she said those words. He had never felt this connected to her, not in the way he did now. Her faith in him had been a constant, even when he didn't believe in himself. And so, as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Danny realized that he wasn't just taking on the world of mathematics. He was taking on his own life. The pizza boy who had once hidden in the shadows was now stepping into the light, ready to face whatever came next. He didn't know where this path would lead him, but for the first time, he was eager to find out. He wasn't afraid anymore. As he sat at his desk one evening solving yet another equation, he looked out the window at the Brooklyn skyline, the city that had always felt so vast and impersonal. But now it felt like home. He had found his place in the world, not as someone defined by his past or his mistakes, but as someone capable of change, of growth, and of success. The road ahead was still uncertain, but Danny knew one thing: he was ready. And with that, he returned to his work, the flicker of possibility burning, brighter than ever before, one equation at a time, one step forward, and the future, his future, had never seemed so full of promise.